The pen was still in my hand when the phone rang. I had been sitting at that kitchen table since 7 that morning. Thank you notes lined up in front of me, each one written in the same careful handwriting Tolliver always said, looked like Sunday morning. 31 years of marriage, and the man still noticed things like that. I noticed things too. I noticed which neighbor brought store-bought potato salad to the repast and put it in a dish like she cooked it. I noticed which condolence card had a printed signature instead of a real one. I noticed that my son Cordell had checked his watch twice during the burial, and that his wife Candace had not cried once, not even when they lowered the casket. I had been trying, for 3 weeks, not to think about that. My name is Caletha Foxworth. I am 61 years old, a retired school administrator, and 3 weeks ago I buried my husband of 31 years. Or I believed I did. What I am about to tell you will change everything you think you know about grief, about family, and about what people are willing to do for money. If you are watching this from somewhere that knows what it means to love somebody completely, stay with me. The phone rang at 10:42 in the morning. I know the time because I had just written it on an envelope. Tolliver's cousin in Birmingham, a woman who sent flowers and a card with her real signature. Caletha. It was Dr. Pemberton, our family physician for 19 years. His voice was careful in a way that had nothing to do with bedside manner. Careful the way a man is careful when he is holding something that could shatter. How are you holding up? Fine, I said. The word people use when they mean the opposite. I need you to come in. Today. I set the pen down. Elias? What is this about? Not like this. A pause, short but heavy. Come in, and bring Isaiah. Something moved through my chest that was not grief. Grief I knew by then. Grief had a shape and a weight and a place it settled. This was something else, something with an edge. Isaiah is in Washington, I said. I know where he is. I know what he does. Tolliver told me at his last physical. Said it with the kind of pride a man saves for the things he can't say directly. Another pause. I need him in the room, Caletha. Please come in. He ended the call before I could ask another question. I sat at that table for 90 seconds. I counted, before I picked the phone back up and called my oldest son. Isaiah and I had never been easy with each other. He had grown up in this house but never fully belonged to it, and we had both learned to live with the space that truth created between us. I did not perform the call. I stated the facts. Pemberton called. Something is wrong. He asked for you by name and mentioned your work. Isaiah was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, I'll be there by 6. That was all. No questions, no warmth, no hesitation. Just a man who heard the signal underneath the words and responded to it. I had learned over the years to receive that kind of efficiency as its own language of love. I moved to Tolliver's chair after I hung up, sat in it, ran my hand along the armrest, the worn place where his hand had rested for 31 years. The house was quiet around me. The same house he built, the same rooms he filled, the same kitchen where he burned toast every Sunday morning and never once admitted it. Something was wrong. I did not know what yet. But I knew that Pemberton had asked for a federal agent, and that a doctor who will not explain himself on the phone is a doctor who has seen something he cannot unsee. Isaiah was at my door by 5:43. He did not hug me when I opened it. He looked at my face the way a man looks at a situation he is already assessing, and said, "You ready?" I told him yes, which was the same kind of lie as fine, but in a different direction. We drove to Pemberton's office in the kind of silence that has weight. Isaiah kept both hands on the wheel. I watched Atlanta move past the window and thought about the last time we had been in a car together, Tolliver's retirement dinner 4 years ago. Isaiah flying in for exactly 36 hours and leaving before the weekend was over. We had made conversation over a meal and called it closeness. That was what we knew how to do. Pemberton's office smelled the same as it always had. Same diplomas, same lamp in the corner that gave the room a warmer light than the overhead. He was standing when we came in, which told me something. A man who stands to receive you in his own office is a man who has been rehearsing what he is about to say. The file was on the desk. He did not open it immediately. He looked at both of us and said, "I want you to understand that I sat with this for 2 days before I called. Some of these records came across my desk as part of follow-up documentation related to Tolliver's death. When I saw something that didn't make sense, I reviewed every record I could legally access. Then I checked them again. I needed to be certain I wasn't seeing something that wasn't there." Isaiah said, "Open it." Pemberton opened it. The first thing he showed us was the intake form from the night of the accident. He pointed to one line, blood type. I did not need him to explain why it mattered. In 1998, when Tolliver had his first cardiac scare and they ran every test available, I sat in a waiting room and a nurse read his blood type back to me from a clipboard. I had never forgotten it the way you never forget the details attached to fear. The type on that intake form was wrong. My hand went flat on the table, not a dramatic gesture. My hand simply stopped being a hand that was holding itself and became a hand that needed the table underneath it. That alone wouldn't have brought me to this conclusion, Pemberton said quietly. People make data entry errors. Records get entered incorrectly. I thought that's what I was looking at. He opened another section of the file. The problem is what happened when I started checking everything else. Pemberton moved to the second flag. The accident report documented a guardrail impact at moderate speed on I-20. The cause of death listed on the certificate, blunt force trauma, internal hemorrhaging, appeared difficult to reconcile with the information available in the responding officer's report. He explained it plainly, without performance. Then he showed us the hospital record, or rather, the lack of one. There were admission entries, administrative documentation, basic processing records. There was no complete physician examination note attached to the file supporting the death certification. Isaiah leaned forward. His face changed. I had not seen that particular change before, but I recognized it immediately. It was the face of a man whose training had replaced everything personal, and what was left was precise and unreachable. "Who requested that attending?" he said, quiet, almost casual. Pemberton looked at him. "That's the third thing. Dr. Merriweather's name appears on the certification paperwork. Nothing else. No completed examination notes. No attending summary. No follow-up documentation." He paused. "Just a signature." The room went very still. I understood, in that stillness, that my body had arrived somewhere my mind was not yet willing to follow. The intake form, the injury discrepancy, a signature attached to documentation that should have existed but didn't. 3 things that should not exist, sitting in a manila folder on a desk I had sat across from for 19 years. Isaiah closed the file. He looked at me. "Don't touch anything at the house. Don't call anyone." I looked back at him. "Isaiah!" "Tell me why." He held my gaze and told me plainly, if something criminal had occurred, every surface, every message, every unopened envelope was potential evidence. Disturbing any of it could compromise what came next. I absorbed that. Every word of it. Then I nodded once. That nod cost me something I could not name yet. Because nodding meant I was no longer a widow receiving information. It meant I believed him. Neither of us spoke until we were out of the parking lot. Isaiah pulled into traffic with both hands on the wheel. The same hands that were small enough once to disappear completely inside mine. I used to hold them crossing streets, through parking lots, at the doctor's office when he was afraid but too proud to say so. I watched them now and thought about how much a person's hands stay the same even when everything else changes. I did not try to fill the silence. 3 weeks of grief had taught me that silence was not always absence. Sometimes it was the only honest thing left in a room. Atlanta moved past my window. The I-20 interchange, the Cascade Road exit, streets I had driven for 30 years, attached to a life I believed I understood completely. I watched them pass and let the quiet between us be what it was. Isaiah spoke first. His voice was level, almost casual, the kind of casual that is not casual at all. "Who called you from the hospital that night?" "Cordell." The name came out without hesitation. Only Cordell. He said it happened fast, that by the time they reached the hospital there was nothing left to do. Isaiah nodded once, said nothing. Let 4 blocks pass. "Who identified the body?" My hands tightened slightly in my lap. "Cordell. He told me it was better if I didn't, that the accident had been—" I stopped, reconstructed. "He said it was better that way, that I should remember Tolliver the way he was." I had believed him. That was the part that sat in my chest like a stone now. I had believed him because grief does that. It hands you to whoever seems to be managing what you cannot. And you go willingly because the alternative is standing alone in the middle of something you cannot hold. Isaiah let another silence pass. Longer this time. We were on Cascade now, 4 minutes from the house. Whose idea was the closed casket? I did not answer immediately. Not because I didn't know, because saying it out loud made it a different kind of fact. "Cordell," I said. The word landed in the car and stayed there. Isaiah did not react, did not nod, did not shift in his seat, did not make a sound. He simply let it sit between us. And the silence that followed was the loudest thing I had heard since Pemberton's phone call. We turned into the driveway. Isaiah put the car in park and left his hands on the wheel. I looked at the house Tolliver built, the one he spent 2 years designing and 6 months constructing, because he wanted every room to catch the morning light. I had always loved that about him. The way he thought about mornings even when he was building something meant to last. Something completed its turn inside me sitting there. I was not a widow processing difficult information. I was a woman who had been managed, guided through her own husband's death by the hands of someone who needed her grief to be convenient. The cold of that understanding was nothing like grief. Grief was soft, even at its worst. This was something harder, something with edges. Isaiah finally spoke. "I need you to let me work." I turned and looked at him, really looked, the way I had not allowed myself to in years. The face of a son I had not always known how to hold. A man who had driven from Washington in under 6 hours without being asked twice. "Then work," I said. 2 words. That was all it took to cross 31 years of distance between a mother and a son who had never been easy with each other. He nodded, got out of the car. I sat one more moment in the quiet and thought about the name Cordell, the way it had answered every single question, every single one. Isaiah was in the guest room with his laptop and his phone and whatever federal agents do when they are working in silence. I was alone in the living room with the lights low and 31 years of memory. I rewound the funeral the way you rewind something you should have understood the first time. Cordell at the podium. I had thought the eulogy was beautiful. I had sat in the front pew and let the words move through me the way good words do at funerals. Smoothly, mercifully, without snagging on anything. He spoke about his father's work ethic, his integrity, the company he built from nothing. Every sentence was correct. Every pause landed exactly where a pause should land. That was the thing I had missed. Not because there had been anything obviously wrong, because there had been one moment, small enough to disappear inside everything else. Halfway through the eulogy, Cordell lost his place. Not for long. 2 seconds, maybe 3. I remember thinking then that the grief had finally caught him. But standing in my living room now, replaying it, I remembered what happened next. He didn't search for the words the way grieving people do. He glanced toward the second row, toward Candace, just once. Then he continued exactly where he had stopped. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now, it sat differently. Grief is not precise. Grief stumbles. It reaches for words and misses and tries again. What Cordell delivered at that podium was not grief. It was a performance assembled by someone who had already finished grieving, or had never started, and knew exactly how long each note should hold. I moved to Candace in my memory. She had stood at his side through the entire service with her hand resting on his back. Not the hand of a woman steadying her grieving husband, but the hand of someone keeping contact. I remembered another thing. At the graveside, before the service started, one of Tolliver's oldest foremen had walked over to her. He hugged her. He cried. Candace thanked him politely and immediately looked over his shoulder toward Cordell. Not rude, not cold, just distracted. At the time, I had blamed shock. Now, I wasn't sure what I blamed. She had not cried. Not once. Not at the graveside, not at the repast, not in the parking lot, when 3 of Tolliver's oldest employees stood together and wept without embarrassment. I had told myself it was just her way. Some people don't cry in public. I had given her that. I would not give her certainty. Not anymore. Then the board members. 3 of them had come to the repast, men who had sat across tables from Tolliver for 20 years, who had built something real alongside him. I had thanked them for coming. I remembered their faces now and read them differently. Not because they spoke to Cordell. That would have been normal. Because they stayed with him. Again and again. Every time I looked up, the same 3 men were near him, not discussing memories, not telling stories about Tolliver, talking quietly, waiting for other conversations to end before resuming. The body language was not grief adjacent. It was business, a meeting dressed as a funeral. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I picked up my phone. Not to call Cordell. I had the discipline for that, and the discipline cost me something every hour I maintained it. I called Harlan Osby, Tolliver's personal attorney, the man who had drafted our living trust 12 years ago in an office on Peachtree Street with photographs of his grandchildren on every surface. He answered on the second ring. I asked him one question: whether anyone had contacted his office regarding trustee substitution proceedings on the Foxworth Living Trust. The pause before he answered was 4 seconds long. I counted. No formal filing, he said carefully. But I did receive a call last week from someone in Cordell's office asking procedural questions. General questions, they said. I thanked him. Ended the call. Isaiah appeared in the doorway. He had his phone in his hand and the look of a man who had been about to say something before he read the room. He looked at me, at the phone in my lap. You called Osby? Not a question, not approval either. Something more careful than both. The look of a man recalibrating. Cordell's office called him last week, I said. Procedural questions about the trust. Nothing filed yet. Isaiah was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, when did you start thinking about the trust? The moment you told me he filed for letters testamentary in 48 hours, I said. The company was never the real asset. He looked at me for a long moment. Something shifted between us that had not been there before. Isaiah was at the kitchen table before I came downstairs. His laptop was open, 2 windows side by side, and he had a legal pad next to it with handwriting I could not read from the doorway. I made coffee without asking if he wanted any. Some things you do not ask. I set his mug beside the laptop and sat across from him and waited. He turned the screen toward me. Georgia Secretary of State Business Filings, Cordell Foxworth. The dates were listed in clean black type, the kind of clean that does not care what it costs you to read it. He filed for letters testamentary 2 days after the death certificate was processed, Isaiah said. That's the legal authority to begin acting on behalf of an estate. 2 days, Mama. Most people are still making funeral arrangements. I looked at the dates. Did the math without being asked. Tolliver's death certificate was filed on a Tuesday. Cordell filed on Thursday. I had been sitting in this kitchen on Thursday, writing thank you notes in my Sunday morning handwriting, and my son had been at the probate court. The board voted him interim CEO 4 days later, Isaiah continued, before the burial, while you were receiving people in this house. I kept my hands around the mug. It was the only thing I trusted myself to hold on to, without it showing. Isaiah called Harlan Osby on speaker. I had already spoken to Osby the night before, but this was different. Isaiah asking the legal questions I did not have the language for. Osby confirmed what I had suspected. The living trust held the controlling interest in the company. Not the board, not the estate filing, the trust. And the trust required either Tolliver's signature or a completed probate proceeding, a process that took months, not days, before a single share of controlling interest could transfer. Cordell had board authority. He was sitting in his father's chair, signing his father's contracts, running his father's company. But the asset he actually wanted was behind a door he did not have the key to. Which means, I said slowly, he needs more time. Isaiah looked at me. It means the trust was the obstacle. He paused. And it means he was moving unusually fast for someone who had supposedly just lost his father. That landed differently. Because it wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. I sat with that, set my mug down, opened my laptop. Tolliver had a personal Gmail account, not the company system, nothing to do with the business. A private account he used for family correspondence and personal records. I had known the password for 11 years because he gave it to me during a medical procedure in 2013 and never changed it, the way people don't change things that feel safe. I opened it. He had forwarded himself a set of board meeting minutes 3 months ago, the kind of thing a careful man does when something doesn't sit right. I read the names of men who had sat in our church pew on Christmas Eve, men who had shaken my hand at the repast and told me Tolliver was one of a kind. I found the line that stopped me halfway down the second page. Board member noted that Mr. Cordell Foxworth had already begun the transition process in anticipation of future leadership succession. The meeting date was 6 weeks before the accident. I set my mug down very carefully. The way you set something down when your hands are no longer entirely trustworthy. He started before Tolliver was even buried, I said. Isaiah leaned forward and read the date again. His voice was level, quiet, careful. Succession planning by itself isn't unusual. I looked at him. But this wasn't by itself. He nodded once. No, not with everything else we found. The room went still. The board minutes, the estate filing, the rush toward control. Each piece could be explained on its own. Together, they were becoming harder to ignore. Isaiah looked back at the screen. He started before the accident. That sentence sat in the kitchen between us like something that had been waiting a long time to be said out loud. Not proof? Not yet. But no longer something either of us could ignore. Neither of us touched our coffee after that. Isaiah made the call at 8:17 in the morning. I sat across the table and watched his face while he talked. He had laid everything out on the table the night before. The filings, the trust documents, Osby's confirmation, the board minutes with their troubling date. Now he was delivering it to people with the authority to decide whether any of it warranted further attention. His voice was measured and precise, moving through the facts without emotion, the way water moves through a pipe. Not because he didn't feel anything, but because feeling had no function in that particular moment. I watched him and thought, this is what he was built for. Whatever distance had grown between this house and the man he became, he had built something real on the other side of it. By midday, the Atlanta field office had opened what Isaiah called a preliminary assessment. Not a case, not yet. A process for determining whether the facts justified one. Isaiah explained the distinction without being asked. The assessment would allow agents and analysts to review available information, verify records, and determine whether there was enough to move forward. If there was, investigators would pursue the legal authority needed to access additional records. He also told me he had been designated family liaison for the duration. Protocol, he said, not punishment. A conflict of interest designation that kept him adjacent to the matter without allowing him to direct it. He said it without apology. I received it the same way. By 3 that afternoon, he had an update. The field office had started with publicly available records, the same Georgia Secretary of State database anyone could access, but reviewed by people trained to recognize patterns. They located an LLC registered 18 months ago, a property management company, on paper. The registered agent was listed under a name I did not immediately recognize. Then Isaiah said it was Candace's maiden name. I set my coffee down. 18 months ago. Yes. I did the math out loud, the way I had done it with the filing dates. Tolliver was alive 18 months ago. He was healthy. He was sitting at the head of his own company. I stopped. She didn't decide to do this after something went wrong. She decided before anything happened at all. Isaiah nodded. He did not add anything to that because nothing needed to be added. The LLC alone wasn't proof, but it was enough to justify a closer look. Over the following days, investigators began assembling a clearer picture. Records obtained through lawful process showed a pattern of payments connected to the LLC. Small amounts. Consistent amounts. Amounts that attracted little attention individually, but looked very different when placed side by side across more than a year. Not random transfers. A deliberate, patient pattern built by someone who understood exactly how to avoid attracting attention. 14 months. She had been moving money for 14 months before Tolliver ever went near that road on I-20. I thought about Candace at family dinners. The way she asked about the company, always framed as curiosity, as a daughter-in-law wanting to understand what her husband would one day inherit. She asked about vendors, about contracts, about how the trust was structured. I had thought she was making an effort. I had given her credit for making an effort. Every question was a measurement. Every dinner was a research session. Every smile across my table was a woman calculating how long it would take to dismantle what sat on it. The rage I had been carrying since I rewound that funeral and watched Candace's hand on Cordell's back, steady, directing, running the whole performance, completed its turn inside me. It did not arrive loud. It did not need to. It settled into something cold and precise and patient, the kind of anger that does not spend itself in a moment because it understands that moments are not what this requires. I looked at Isaiah. What do we do now? We wait, he said. Let them work. A pause. You've already done more than you know. I looked at my hands flat on the table. Candace had spent 18 months building this. I intended to be part of what took it apart. Waiting is its own kind of work. I wiped down counters that were already clean, refolded dish towels I had folded the day before, straightened picture frames that were not crooked. The house had never been more orderly, and I had never felt less in control of anything inside it. Isaiah had left early that morning with his phone already at his ear, and I had been given the only instruction I was finding impossible to follow. Stay still. I was not built for still. Isaiah called at 11:43. Wendell Greer, he said. ER intake nurse at Grady. I sat down at the kitchen table. And? The investigators have been building a timeline around him. His voice had that careful quality again, the one he used when facts mattered more than drama. Wendell's financial records don't match his salary. I said nothing. There were several unexplained cash deposits over a relatively short period of time. Not enough by themselves to prove anything, but enough to raise questions. I held that in my mind. Questions. Questions were how all of this had started. The money wasn't the only thing, Isaiah continued. Investigators also found a series of contacts between Wendell and people who shouldn't have been connected to this case. I looked out the kitchen window. The trees moved in the wind. Everything else felt still. What kind of contacts? A pattern. That was all he would say. The rest belonged to the investigation. I accepted that. Then he added, he also made a purchase he couldn't easily explain. What purchase? A used Audi. Not brand new, not extravagant, just expensive enough to attract attention when combined with everything else. I asked Isaiah what Wendell Greer looked like. It was not a question he expected. There was a brief pause before he described him. Medium build, early 40s, a man who had worked the same ER intake desk for 11 years without incident. I built the picture carefully in my mind and filed it somewhere I did not intend to revisit until I needed to. A man who had looked at Tolliver Foxworth, a man who had built something real, who burned toast on Sunday mornings, who said my name like it was worth being careful with, and decided silence was worth whatever he had been promised for it. I filed it. I moved on. They want to talk to him, Isaiah said. I want to be there. No, I did not argue. 4 weeks into this, I had learned the difference between the moments that belonged to me and the moments that belonged to the machine. This one belonged to the machine. My presence would compromise the process, and I understood that clearly enough to set my preference aside. 3 days passed, then another 2. Waiting stretched itself across the week. Isaiah called again that evening. I was in the living room with the lamp on and a book I had not read a single page of. He cooperated. Not immediately, not dramatically. Just those 2 words. I sat up. What happened? They showed him what they already knew. A pause. The financial records. The communications. The timeline. Another pause. He came in with an attorney. They spent most of the day denying they had anything useful. I waited. Then they realized investigators already had more of the picture than they thought. The silence between us shifted. He realized he wasn't the person carrying the most risk anymore. I understood exactly what that meant. What did he give you? Enough. The word landed heavily. Then, a property in Douglasville. My heart stopped. Not literally, but close enough that I understood why people use the expression. Wendell put people together. Merriweather signed paperwork. Other people handled the property. His voice had become very quiet. Nobody expected Wendell to carry the whole operation. but he knew enough. I gripped the arm of the chair. Isaiah took a breath. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. Mama. We believe there's a strong possibility he's alive. The room disappeared. Not physically. Just in the way rooms disappear when one sentence pushes every other thought out of them. We're executing a search warrant tomorrow morning at 6. I did not respond immediately. The silence was not absence. It was the sound of a woman being handed something she had not allowed herself to want, because wanting it and losing it would have been unsurvivable. I sat inside that silence and let it be what it was. Then I stood, crossed the living room, sat in Tolliver's chair. I put my hand on the armrest, on the worn place, the place where the fabric had softened and shaped itself to his hand over 31 years of evenings in that chair. I had touched it once before, briefly, the day Pemberton called, without knowing what I was reaching for. Now I knew. I sat in my husband's chair in the quiet of the house he built, and allowed myself, for the first time, to believe he was 25 miles away and still breathing. Isaiah told me about the proffer process over breakfast. A cooperation proffer, he explained, was a structured agreement. The subject comes in with his attorney, discloses what he knows within negotiated terms, and what he says cannot be used directly against him unless he later contradicts it. It was not immunity. It was a door opened carefully, with a lawyer's hand on the frame the entire time. So he talks, I said, but only as much as his attorney allows. That's how it works. I looked at my coffee. What kind of man signs paperwork he knows he shouldn't sign? Isaiah was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who doesn't have an answer. The quiet of someone choosing which true answer to give. A man who made one bad decision 3 years ago, he said finally, and spent every day after that afraid it would surface. I thought about that for the rest of the morning. Isaiah was not in the room when Merriweather arrived. The field office investigators ran the session. But he was briefed in full afterward, and he brought every detail back to me that evening. Sitting at the kitchen table with his notes open and his voice steady, Merriweather had come with his attorney. The attorney managed everything, the framing, the pacing, what was offered and in what order. But Isaiah said the attorney could only manage words. He could not manage the man's face. Merriweather had been carrying weeks of something that had restructured the way he held himself, and it showed in every pause before he answered, and every moment his eyes moved to the table instead of the room. The file came first. 3 years ago, Merriweather had made a serious error involving a patient. Not a paperwork mistake, not a technical oversight. A real error with real consequences. The kind that could have triggered litigation, professional discipline, financial ruin, and the end of a career built over decades. The matter had never become public. Somehow, Cordell found it. Isaiah did not know how, and Merriweather's attorney would not allow investigators to explore that part of the story during the session. But Cordell had documented it, preserved it, held it. And according to Merriweather, he had spent 3 years reminding him that the file still existed, waiting until the moment it became valuable. When Isaiah told me that, I set my pen down. 3 years. Cordell had been holding a loaded file for 3 years. That was not opportunism. That was architecture. The same cold, patient architecture I had seen in Candace's 14 months of diverted payments, and the LLC registered in her maiden name before anything had gone wrong. They had built this the way Tolliver built houses, from the ground up, with a plan. The night of the certificate was next. 4 minutes. Wendell had brought Merriweather a file and a signature packet into a conference room at Grady Memorial, a hospital where Merriweather had worked for 19 years. According to Merriweather, he was told the death had already been medically reviewed and processed through channels above him. What was placed in front of him was presented as final verification paperwork attached to records that had supposedly already been confirmed. 4 minutes later, he signed the worst thing he would ever sign. No independent review, no verification of the underlying records, no confirmation that what he had been told was true. Just a signature attached to paperwork he never should have trusted. 4 minutes to end 31 years of my life as I had known it. Isaiah wrote down the funeral home name as soon as Merriweather provided it. Investigators added it to the growing timeline. I did not say anything when Isaiah finished. He watched my face and did not attempt to fill the silence, which was the right decision. There was nothing to fill it with. The closed casket, the wood under my hands, the goodbye I had said to something that was not my husband. A physician's 4 minutes of fear and cowardice had cost me things I was only beginning to inventory. Isaiah closed his notes. The search warrant executes at 6 tomorrow morning. I'll be there as liaison. He looked at me. You stay here. I know, I said. He nodded, said goodnight. I turned off the kitchen light and sat in the dark for a long time. I did not sleep. The tea had gone cold an hour ago. I was still sitting with it, both hands around the mug the way you hold something when holding is the only available action. The kitchen clock read 12:14. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when they are full of things that cannot be said. Isaiah's door had been closed since 10. I did not know if he was sleeping. I suspected he was lying still with his eyes open, running scenarios the way federal agents probably do before operations, methodical, sequential, preparing for every version of the morning. I hoped that was what he was doing. I needed at least one of us to be prepared. I thought about Tolliver. Not the version of him that had lived inside this investigation for the past 10 days. The victim. The name on the intake form. The man in a room 25 miles away. The real one. The man who burned toast every single Sunday morning for 31 years and never once, not once, admitted it was burned. He would bring it to the table and set it down with the same dignity he brought to everything. And I would eat it without comment, because that was the agreement we had reached somewhere around year 3 and never needed to renegotiate. The man who said my name like it was something worth being careful with. I let myself sit with that for a long time. Then I let myself think about Cordell. I had been managing that particular door for weeks, holding it shut through discipline and necessity. Tonight, I stopped holding it. I let it open, and I sat with what came through. He had been a quiet boy, watchful, the kind of child who observed a room before he entered it, who learned early that attention was a resource that required strategy. I had loved that about him. I had thought it was intelligence. I understood now that it was something else. Or that intelligence and something else had grown together in him so completely that by the time the difference mattered, it was too late to separate them. Loving a child from his first breath and discovering what he chose to become, there was no clean word for that. I did not try to find one. I just sat with the weight of it in the quiet kitchen and let it be exactly as heavy as it was. I thought about Isaiah. 6 hours from Washington without being asked twice. 10 days in this house, sleeping in a guest room he had never fully claimed, doing work that most sons would not have the training or the steadiness to do. There was distance between us that years had built, and neither of us had fully dismantled. But distance was not the same as absence. He had proven that in the first 6 hours. At 2:30, I picked up my phone to call Cordell. I set it back down. The discipline of that, knowing exactly what I wanted to say and choosing, deliberately, to say nothing. cost me something I could feel in my chest, like a physical pressure. I sat with the cost. It was the price of not being foolish. And I had come too far to be foolish now. I walked through the house. I stood in the doorway of every room, the study where Tolliver kept the books he meant to reread, the bedroom where I had been sleeping on my side because the alternative meant acknowledging the space beside me as permanent, and I was not prepared to do that. Each room was its own kind of answer to a question I had been asking myself all night. What are you willing to survive for? By 5:47, I was back at the kitchen table. Isaiah's door opened. He was dressed. He looked at me, took in the cold tea, the coat still on the chair where I had put it at midnight, the fact that I had clearly not moved, and said nothing about any of it. "I'll call you the minute we're inside." I nodded. The door closed. I sat back down and waited for the longest hour of my life. 6 o'clock came and the phone did not ring. I sat at the kitchen table with it face up in front of me and watched the minutes move. 6 o'clock became 6:08. 6:08 became 6:15. I did not move to make coffee. I did not move to turn on a light. The kitchen was gray with early morning, and I sat inside the gray and waited with the particular stillness of a woman who has used up every available version of patience and arrived at something beyond it. 6:32. The phone rang. Isaiah's name on the screen. I answered before the sound completed itself. "Mama." His voice was controlled, the professional control I had come to recognize across 10 days of watching him work. But underneath it, moving quietly like water under ice, was something I had not heard in his voice since he was a boy. Something that had not had room to exist inside the investigator until this moment. "We found him." I gripped the phone. In the background, distant, filtered through the noise of movement and voices, I heard a sound that stopped every clock in my body. A voice, hoarse, weak, unmistakable. The voice of the man who had said my name carefully for 31 years. I closed my eyes. I did not cry. What happened was not crying. It was something deeper and quieter than that. The feeling of a structure that had been braced against collapse for 3 weeks, beginning, carefully and incrementally, to release the tension it had been holding. Not relief. Not yet. Something that came before relief. The first breath after the longest held breath of my life. "Tell him I'm coming," I said. Isaiah was quiet for a moment. "They're evaluating him now." The words came carefully, measured, as though he was choosing everyone. "He's alive. He's conscious. That's what we know." I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "What condition is he in?" "Dehydrated. Weak. Beyond that, I don't have complete information yet." I heard movement in the background. Voices, doors, the organized noise of people doing urgent work. Then Isaiah added something else. "Investigators recovered paperwork from the room." I said nothing. Trust documents, signature pages, things that suggest somebody wanted something from him. The silence between us changed. Not because it explained everything, because it explained enough. Enough to understand why a living man had been hidden instead of buried. I closed my eyes again. "What did he say?" I asked. "When they came in." "What did he say first?" Isaiah was quiet for 1 second. Then, "He asked if Cordell sent us." I put my hand flat on the kitchen table. 3 weeks in a windowless room, and the first question Tolliver Foxworth had rehearsed for whoever came through that door was whether his own son had sent them. He had been alone in the dark long enough to understand exactly what had been done to him and by whom, and he had needed to know, before anything else, whether the people coming through that door were rescue or continuation. That single question told me everything about what 3 weeks in that room had cost him. He asked about you, Isaiah continued. A pause. Then he asked about me. I heard what that meant. A man pulled out of a room after 3 weeks of isolation, using some of his first clear moments to account for the people he loved. Both of them, including the one he had not always known how to reach. Which hospital? I said. Emory. They're transporting him now. Medical wants a full evaluation before... I was already moving. I had my keys before Isaiah finished the sentence. My coat from the chair where it had sat since midnight. My bag from the counter. Atlanta was pale gold outside the window, early morning light on streets I had driven for 30 years. I did not see any of it. I saw the exit for Emory, and I drove toward it, and I did not stop. Tolliver Foxworth was alive. Everything else could wait. His hand was warm. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked into that hospital room and found my husband sitting up in a bed at Emory, with an IV in his arm, and a face that had aged 10 years in 3 weeks. His hand was warm when I took it, and I held that warmth like it was the only fact that mattered, because for the first several minutes, it was. He recognized me immediately. His eyes found mine across the room before I reached the bed, and something in them settled, the way a man settles when the thing he has been holding himself together for finally arrives. He did not speak. I did not speak. I sat in the chair beside him and took his hand in both of mine, and we stayed like that while the monitors beeped and the hallway moved outside the door and Atlanta went about its morning 20 floors below us. I did not know sitting there what was happening across the city. I learned it later. From Isaiah, in the precise and sequential way he delivered information. No editorializing, no cushioning, just the facts in the order they occurred. And this is how I have understood it since. While Tolliver's hand was warm in mine, Candace was sitting in the house she had purchased with stolen money and making the worst decision of her life. Cordell's phone had gone to voicemail twice that morning from a number she did not recognize. She had told herself it was nothing. Then she told herself that again. The second telling was the one that didn't hold. She opened the company accounts from her laptop. By then, according to Isaiah, investigators had already begun collecting records tied to several accounts connected to the inquiry. They were not watching her screen. They were not watching her house. They were watching patterns, records, timelines, the kinds of things people leave behind when they believe nobody is looking. She was looking for something wrong, and she was finding it in the gaps. Transactions delayed, internal approvals pending, access restricted in places it had not been restricted the day before. Cordell still was not answering. What she did next was the thing that 18 months of patience could not survive. She initiated a wire transfer, a substantial movement of funds toward an account associated with the LLC registered under her maiden name. The same maiden name attached to the company investigators had already been examining. The same patient, careful woman who had structured 14 months of payments below every reporting threshold, who had registered property under a name nobody was looking for yet, who had built an entire architecture of fraud without a single visible fingerprint. That woman, in 90 minutes of fear, undid herself completely. The transfer did not clear. The amount was large. The destination account was unusual. The timing was worse. Bank compliance systems flagged it almost immediately for review, exactly the way those systems are designed to flag abrupt movements that fall outside established patterns. Once the alert was generated, additional scrutiny followed. Candace had spent 18 months making herself invisible. She had spent 90 minutes making herself the most visible person in the investigation. Tolliver finally spoke. Not about Cordell. Not about the room in Douglasville. Not about any of it. He turned his head toward me and said, in the voice that had been running through his own head for 3 weeks to keep himself anchored, "I kept thinking about your voice. I kept running it over in my mind so I wouldn't lose it." I did not respond immediately. I held his hand and let the words be what they were. Some things do not need a response. Some things only need to be received. Outside the window, Atlanta moved. Traffic and morning light and ordinary life continuing at its ordinary pace, indifferent to everything that had just broken open inside it. I thought, they don't know yet. Cordell doesn't know. Candace doesn't know what her 90 minutes just cost her. The machine is running and neither of them can see it. All I had to do was hold my husband's hand. So that is what I did. The doorbell rang at 2:17 in the afternoon. I knew who it was before I moved. I stood in the hallway for 3 full seconds, not hesitating, not afraid, but choosing. Choosing the face I would wear, the pace at which I would move, the exact degree of softness I would allow in my eyes when I opened that door. 3 seconds to assemble everything I needed. Then I opened it. Cordell. He was dressed well. He was always dressed well, and his face carried the particular arrangement of concern that I had once accepted as love, and now recognized as craft. He looked at me the way a man looks at a problem he is monitoring. "Mama." He stepped forward slightly. "I've been worried about you. You haven't been returning calls." "I know," I said. "Come in." I stepped back. He entered the house his father built. We sat in the living room. I took the chair nearest the window. He took the sofa, and I watched him not look at Tolliver's chair. It was a specific and deliberate avoidance, the kind that requires awareness of the thing you are not looking at. A man who had genuinely not thought about that chair would have glanced at it without meaning to. Cordell did not glance at it once. I filed that. He asked about the estate paperwork after approximately 4 minutes of careful conversation. How I was sleeping, whether the neighbors had been helpful, whether I needed anything from the house in Cascade. When he arrived at the paperwork, he framed it as concern. He was good at framing. I gave him simple answers that contained nothing useful and were constructed to sound like everything. I mentioned that Harlan Osby had been helpful. I watched Cordell absorb that without reacting and noted the effort it took him. He moved to the company, gently, a son making sure his mother understood the transition was being handled, that she didn't need to worry. I let him talk. I listened with the attentiveness of a woman who was recording every word without a single visible instrument. I stood and went to the kitchen. I made sweet tea the way I had made it for 31 years. The way Tolliver liked it. The way this house had always smelled on summer afternoons. I carried 2 glasses into the living room and set his in front of him and sat back down. I looked at my son. The boy I had carried. The boy whose hands I had held crossing streets and through parking lots and in waiting rooms when he was afraid but too proud to say so. The man he had chosen, with intention and over time, to become. I looked at him across my husband's living room with the full knowledge of every single thing he had done, and I did not let one molecule of it reach my face. I was doing something almost superhuman in that moment. I knew it. I let myself know it. That knowledge was the only private thing I had left in the room, and I held it like a stone in my closed hand. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, a reflex, half a second, barely visible. But something moved across his face in that half second, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. He turned the phone, face down. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Fine," he said. I heard the word the way he had been hearing mine for weeks. He said he had to get going about 10 minutes later. I walked him to the door. He turned and put his arms around me, and I received that hug with complete stillness, Not stiffness, not resistance, but the stillness of a woman who had already said her goodbye to this version of her son on some sleepless night she could not precisely name. The grieving was done. What remained was something quieter and more final. I closed the door, stood in the hallway, breathed. Several months after we brought Tolliver home from Douglasville, he was sitting up in his hospital bed eating real food. Not much, a few bites of eggs, half a piece of toast. But he was doing it without being asked, which was different from those first days when eating had required a kind of convincing that broke my heart quietly every meal. His eyes were clearer. He tracked conversation without losing the thread. The man I had been married to for 31 years was returning to his own face in increments, slowly, unevenly, but returning. He still carried something in his eyes that I could not name and did not try to rush. Some things announced their own timeline. The months between had been full of interviews, subpoenas, attorneys, forensic accountants, search warrants, grand jury testimony, and investigators moving carefully through the wreckage Cordell and Candace had spent 18 months creating. The machine had not moved quickly. It had moved thoroughly. I was reading in the chair beside his bed when Isaiah called. "It's done, Mama." 4 words. His voice carried something I had not heard in it across all the days of this, not satisfaction, not triumph. The sound of a process reaching the point it had been building toward for months. I set my book down. "Tell me." He read the charges in sequence. I listened to each one without interrupting. Federal kidnapping, conspiracy to commit fraud, falsifying vital records, money laundering, wire fraud, structuring of financial transactions. A federal grand jury had returned indictments that morning. I repeated each charge under my breath as Isaiah named it, not for him, not for Tolliver, but for something in me that needed to hear each one spoken in my own voice. As if I were keeping a record that existed nowhere else. As if saying them made them permanent in a way that paperwork alone could not. Tolliver was watching my face. He had not heard a word Isaiah said. He did not need to. He read every charge from my expression the way a man reads weather, not from a single sign, but from the accumulation of small shifts. By the time I lowered the phone, he knew the shape of what had happened without knowing a single specific. Isaiah told me about Wendell Greer. Formally charged, no cooperation agreement. Facing the full weight of the conspiracy allegations investigators believed they could prove. Then Merriweather. He had surrendered through his attorney months earlier and continued cooperating under the proffer agreement negotiated after the Douglasville raid. Controlled. Documented, exactly as arranged. I felt something about Merriweather that I could not cleanly categorize. Not mercy. I was not in a position for mercy. Not hatred either, which surprised me. Something more exhausted than both. A man who had made one terrible error, spent 3 years being owned by it, and then spent 4 minutes completing the destruction. There was nothing satisfying in that. There was only the long, tired arithmetic of bad choices compounding. I ended the call and looked at Tolliver. I told him all of it. The arrests, Cordell taken from the company offices, Candace from the house. The charges against each of them, Wendell, Merriweather. I did not soften any of it, and I did not rush through it. He had earned every word of the truth. He listened with his hands flat on the blanket. When I finished, he closed his eyes. I waited. When he opened them, he did not say thank God. Did not say finally. Did not say a single word about himself or what had been done to him or what any of it meant for his company or his freedom or his life. He said, "How's Isaiah?" I looked at my husband, this man who had spent 3 weeks in a dark room with nothing but his own thoughts, and understood that somewhere in that darkness, he had turned over every year of distance between himself and his oldest son and arrived at something he had not been able to say before the room gave him the time to say it. He's good, I said. He's really good, Tolliver. He nodded slowly, looked out the window. Atlanta sat beyond the glass, the city where he had built something real and nearly lost everything. I thought about what gets rebuilt now and what doesn't. They were not the same question. Tolliver Foxworth had not been a passenger in his own car in 30 years. I noticed it the moment he lowered himself into the seat, the way his hands moved briefly toward where the steering wheel would have been before settling in his lap. A small gesture. The kind a body makes when it has forgotten, for just a moment, that things have changed. I adjusted the mirrors I did not need to adjust and pulled out of the Emory parking structure and drove home through Atlanta with the careful attention of a woman who needed her hands to have something specific to do. Neither of us spoke. This was the silence of two people who had survived something and had not yet found the language for what surviving it meant. He touched the wall first. He walked through the front door and stopped in the entry and put his right hand flat against the wall, the one he had put up himself in 1993, the summer before Isaiah started school. I remembered that summer. He had worked on weekends, shirtless in the Atlanta heat, measuring twice before every cut, because that was how he did everything. The wall had stood for 31 years without requiring a single repair. He stood with his hand on it for a long moment. Then he moved further into the house. He went to his chair. He did not go to the kitchen first, or the bedroom, or the study. He went directly to his chair the way a man goes to the thing that proves to him he is actually home and not still assembling the idea of it from memory. He sat down. I stood in the doorway and watched, and did not fill the silence with anything because some silences are not empty. This one was full of 31 years of evenings in that chair, and I was not going to put a single unnecessary word inside it. Isaiah came out of the kitchen. He had been in there since we arrived home. I had heard the quiet sounds of it, the refrigerator opening, the low click of the burner. He came out with 2 plates. Eggs, toast. Nothing elaborate. Nothing that required anyone to make a decision about what they wanted or how they felt. He set one plate on the side table next to his father's chair and sat down across from him with his own. Tolliver looked at the plate. Then he looked at Isaiah. Something passed between them that I did not have a name for and did not need one. Tolliver picked up the fork. Isaiah picked up his. They ate together in the quiet living room of the house his father had built. And that was the whole conversation. And it was everything. That evening, after Isaiah had gone to his room and the house had settled into its nighttime version of itself, Tolliver told me one thing about the room in Douglasville. Just one thing. I will not repeat it here. It belonged to him and he gave it to me and I received it without moving, without reaching for his hand, without trying to compress it into something more manageable than it was. I let it be exactly the size it was. When he finished, I did not say it was over. I did not say we would be fine or that we could leave it behind us. I said, "You're here. That's where we start." He looked at me the way he had looked at me across 31 years of mornings and arguments and ordinary Tuesdays and the kind of love that doesn't announce itself. He nodded once. Later, I walked past Isaiah's door. His light was still on underneath it. No sounds of packing, no mention of Washington, no mention of leaving at all. I stood with my hand not quite touching the wood. Then I went to bed. The gavel came down at 10:41 in the morning. Almost 11 months had passed since the morning Dr. Pemberton called and asked me to come in. 11 months of motions, hearings, depositions, forensic reviews, probate proceedings, attorneys, and paperwork thick enough to fill entire boxes. The legal work had been done over months. The arguments had been made. The records had been examined. The findings had been written. And then, finally, it came down to 4 minutes. I watched the judge issue the final orders in sequence: the letters testamentary, the board resolutions, the interim CEO designation, each one formally set aside with the same flat, unhurried authority. Every legal move Cordell had made in the weeks after that death certificate was filed, dismantled through months of litigation, and finalized in under 4 minutes, less time than it had taken Merriweather to sign the worst thing he ever signed. Something released in my chest when it was done, not dramatically. No gasp, no tears, nothing that would have been visible to the person sitting beside me. Just a slow, structural release, like a beam that has been load-bearing for months, finally being relieved of the weight. I had been holding something since the morning Pemberton called and said, "Come in." I had not known, until that gavel, exactly how much of me had been engaged in the holding. Tolliver's first day back at the company had happened months earlier. His return had not been immediate. Recovery had taken time. Physical therapy, follow-up appointments, the careful rebuilding that comes after 3 weeks of confinement, and everything that followed it. I remembered that first morning clearly. I went with him. I watched the lobby from a position slightly behind and to the right, close enough to see every face, far enough not to crowd his return. The employees who didn't know the full story registered something between shock and relief when he walked through the door. The ones who had suspected something was wrong, I could identify them immediately, the way I had always been able to identify the people in any room who were paying real attention. Those faces did something different. A loosening. The particular expression of a person who has been quietly carrying a suspicion they were afraid was wrong and has just been told they were right. I read every one of them. That had always been my nature. It had served me well. Isaiah's last morning came on a Tuesday. Not that same week, not even that same month. Life had settled enough by then that leaving was finally possible. I made breakfast without announcing it as a last breakfast, without building ceremony around it, without doing anything that would require any of us to perform a feeling we were still in the middle of having. I put food on the table and sat down, and the 3 of us ate together in the kitchen of the house Tolliver built, unhurried, with nowhere to be and nothing to solve. That was the meal we had earned. I let it be exactly that. Afterward, Isaiah and Tolliver stood in the driveway while I watched from the kitchen window. I could not hear them. I saw Tolliver put his hand on Isaiah's shoulder, the same shoulder I had watched carry this family's crisis for months without complaint. And I saw Isaiah's head drop once, briefly, the way a man's head drops when something he has been holding finally has somewhere to go. Then it came back up. I did not need to hear a single word of it. Later that afternoon, after court had finally closed the last remaining chapter, we drove to the company together. The boardroom was on the 4th floor. The same room where men had voted Cordell in while I was sitting in this house writing thank you notes in my Sunday morning handwriting. I walked in beside Tolliver, not behind him, not in the chair along the wall, beside him, at that table, in a room where my presence was not required and was therefore exactly right. The board members who had voted Cordell in were present. Their discomfort was visible, and it was not my problem. I thought about Cordell, not with the cold rage of the LLC discovery or the iron discipline of the sweet tea afternoon, with something quieter and more permanent, the grief that belongs specifically to mothers who loved a child from his very first breath and watched him choose, slowly and deliberately, to become something they cannot follow. That grief does not resolve when the gavel comes down. It does not dissolve when the handcuffs go on. It simply finds a place inside you where it can live without consuming everything around it. Under the table, Tolliver reached over and took my hand. I looked at what we had built, the company, the marriage, the 31 years, the survival of all 3. They tried to bury what we built. But you can't bury something that was never finished growing.